Eilvig woke in the pre-dawn chill of the forest. His muscles ached, and his belly grumbled. 3 days he had been on this hunt, and he had eaten the last of his rations the night before. Game was becoming ever more scarce in these once lively woods. He rose, stretched out his tired limbs, and tried to get the kink out of his neck. He knew he could not return home until he had completed this hunt. His father, Leofric, was the human ruler of his hometown of Edelber, and Eilvig could not afford to disappoint him. He knew these woods like the back of his hand, for he and the other lads had hunted here since they were old enough to string a bow. Most of his childhood friends had died, or simply not returned from the last war their elven overlords had deemed necessary. Eilvig had been conscripted, but his father's rank and wealth had meant Eilvig was fitted with a horse and allowed to join the army as an outrider. The common folk often said, in war, the infantry are there to die, and the cavalry are there to run away. This turned out to be true in his first major engagement. Eilvig's light cavalry brigade had been chased off the field of battle quite early on. They were a skirmisher force, mostly equipped as horse archers, that would harry the flanks of infantry units and pick the enemy apart during their march. But once battle had commenced, the enemy's heavy cavalry, headed by half a dozen paladins of Sol Invicta, had cut through half of his unit before his commander had sounded the retreat. Luckily, his lord had been victorious in that battle, but he had won no honor and lost many friends. But that hardship was behind him, and more pressing matters concerned him now. His village, Edelber, was slowly dying. The last few years had taken many, either by bloodshed, disease, or starvation. With so many men gone to fight, the fields had been mostly left untended, and the year's harvest was a pittance. This winter, many and more had starved throughout the kingdom. But now, the veil of winter was lifting from the land, and Eilvig needed a prize catch to feed his father's people and to offer a sacrifice in hopes of a fertile spring. In this land, great elk had been plentiful since the dawn of humanity. Edelber's symbol was even the great white stag in a field of trees. As a young child on his first hunt, Eilvig had gotten separated from his group as a pack of dire wolves ambushed them. He was lost for over a day when he ran into a great white stag drinking from a stream in the woods. The boy had approached it and drank water beside it. Once doing so, he noticed a strange humanoid creature drinking by the other side of the elk. It had large, cat-like yellow eyes and was covered in a thin and soft fur that resembled bark. The humanoid was tall and thin, but not so big as the elf lords that he had seen. The creature had touched young Eilvig's forehead, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up against a tree on the outskirts of his hometown. Eilvig had not seen the creature like it since, nor had he seen a great elk of such immense size and grace again. It was customary for the hunters of Edelber to kill a great elk each spring and feast to usher in a fertile new year. But these last few years, the beasts had been harder to find, and the year was proving even more difficult due to a lack of skilled huntsmen. This morning, however, Eilvig had a good feeling. As he rolled up his sleeping roll and packed up his little camp, he thought about the creature and the great elk he had seen as a child. At the thought of them, he had a stirring in his gut. Not nerves, but hope. He made his way south, as he had been since beginning his hunt 3 days earlier. He had not realized it at the time, but now he knew he was making his way back to that fateful spot where the dire wolves had ambushed his hunting party as a child. Though he had never again been able to find that stream where he met his childhood saviors. This time would be different, though, he thought. It had to be. This time it was not him that needed saving, but his entire village. He had a feeling the forest would provide aid, just as it had done before. In the morning, the woods seemed majestic, with rays of light plunging through the canopy and the beautiful smells of pine and damp earth sweetening each breath. Eilvig stopped to pick some wild berries when he heard a monstrous bugle, a stag, calling to its mates. At this, Eilvig dropped the berries and moved quickly and quietly towards the sound. As he expertly made his way through the forest, he heard the bugle twice more. It seemed he was getting closer. After closing some distance, Eilvig felt like he was almost upon the elk, so he slowed his pace and started looking for tracks, tufts of fur, excrement, or any other promising signs of his prey. After a bit of searching, Eilvig found hoofprints larger than any he had seen before. His heart began to race in elation, but he told himself to take a few calming breaths and think like the calm predator that he was. He followed the tracks quietly for a few minutes until they quickly turned east. This made him stop and look around, trying to find what could have made the beast change directions so abruptly. It was then that he saw it, the bone charms dangling in a few of the nearby trees, the slight scent of rot in the air, and a sudden drop in the temperature a few degrees. Eilvig realized he had blindly stumbled into forbidden territory, a spot of evil in the forest. Adelber legends stated that this site was eternally desecrated after an ancient elven sacrifice had happened there. Some say it's the spot where the first elf-on-elf violence ever occurred. Generations ago, a man had asked about the history of this spot to an elf lord and had lost his tongue for it. Despite his initial reaction to flee, Eilvig knew he could not afford to abandon this hunt, and he saw the great elk's tracks leading right into the heart of the forbidden zone. Eilvig steeled his nerves and fortified his resolve. His failure in this hunt would mean no food, and even worse, no sacrifice at the spring festival. This could spell doom for all of Adelber. With a deep breath, he took his bow to hand and notched an arrow before moving forward stealthily. After following the tracks a bit farther, Eilvig noticed he was coming to the base of a large hill with a clearing just at its foot. He noticed something moving in the clearing. It seemed big and white. He approached the clearing. The smell of rotting flesh intensified, and he noticed skeletal remains scattered around. He came right up to the tree line and stopped before the open grove. There were bodies everywhere, and 3 stone pillars rising at the foot of the hill. But all Eilvig could see was the great white stag elk that was staring directly at him. The stag then tilted its massive head to the left, and Eilvig saw what he was pointing to. Beneath the great stag was the same creature Eilvig had seen as a child, tall, slender, large cat-like yellow eyes, and short, soft fur that resembled bark. The creature was stooped over a tall man in armor who was crumpled upon the ground. The creature was muttering something, and green light was coming up from the ground underneath the man in armor. Eilvig watched for a few seconds before deciding to step into the grove and try to converse with the creature. As he did, the stag stamped its front hoof and gave a snort. This caught the attention of the creature, who rose to face Eilvig. It stared directly into his eyes intensely for a few seconds. Eilvig then felt its presence in his mind. It was a warm, calming feeling, and slowly words formed from the swirl of emotion that was filling his consciousness. "Hello again, little one. You've grown into a fine specimen. I have led you here to help this man, for he shall help you as well." With that, the creature nodded its head towards the armored man on the ground, and then back to Eilvig. The creature then leapt swiftly onto the back of the great elk, and both rushed off into the forest. Eilvig was half in a daze at this point, never having his brain stimulated in such a way before. By the time he regained his composure, he felt a bit empty and alone, as the creature's calming presence no longer filled his mind. He had nothing but questions and no one to give answers. So, after a few seconds, he approached the tall man, who still remained in a heap on the ground. Getting a good look up close, Eilvig realized this was no common man. He must have stood around 6'4", almost a foot taller than the common human, but short for a high elf lord, who was typically around 6'7". Eilvig also noticed the nasty-looking dents and puncture holes covering the man's armor. Dried blood caked the holes, but they didn't seem to be actively bleeding any longer. Eilvig did not know if he could help much, but he did know one thing. No living soul should stick around in this cursed place. The man was bigger than Eilvig, and with all that metal on, he would be much too heavy to move. Something had to be done, and quickly. Eilvig began to remove the armor, piece by piece. He started with the chest, unfastening the front straps on the brigandine. Its cloth was a deep purple with golden colored studs, black leather laces, and had bright yellow pauldrons covering the shoulders. Then he went to the arms, removing the darkened steel lobstered gauntlets and vambraces that had a swirling golden inlay. It took a lot of maneuvering, but he then worked the chainmail hauberk of interlinking black and golden colored chains up and over the man's head. The boots had no metal, so were left on, and the thighs were just covered in cloth, since they were usually covered by the mail. The last thing to be removed was the darkened steel greaves on the man's lower legs that had the same golden inlay as the gauntlets and vambraces. Now, stripped of armor, the big man was more manageable, but also more strange. As he removed the armor, Eilvig was able to see bits of skin underneath gashes in the cloth. It was purple, and it was shot through with lines of faint golden light. He also noticed the recent wounds were being suffused with this golden light and appeared to be slowly but noticeably healing right before his eyes. The last odd thing was the man's face. From a distance, he thought it was a strange helmet, but up close he could tell it was a mask. It was a wooden shell made of two halves, one for the face and the other for the back of the head. Both were sewn into a fabric that covered the top of the head. The two halves were then laced together at the sides. Both the front and back pieces were covered in finely sculpted obsidian with a white stone carved into the shape of a horizontally elongated eye in the center of the face. The obsidian face was strange as well. It had two noses, one on each side, each with half a mouth going to the edges of the mask. Eilvig undid the laces along the sides and lifted off the mask. What he saw terrified him. This was no man, but a night elf. None had been spotted in this kingdom, as far as Eilvig was aware, but the neighboring kingdom was said to have been ravaged by mercenary companies of them in the last war. It was said they were demon-corrupted elves that spewed forth from the void because of all the blasphemy of Sol Invicta that had been going on. They looked very similar to the High Elven lords, but were shorter and more robust. They had the dark purple skin and white hair with large black eyes that lacked any sclera. During the war, they were said to only attack at night because Sol Invicta itself would not deign to let such evil walk the land as he shone above brightly. But it was daytime now, and this night elf was still alive. Also, he had veins of golden light. They were healing his wounds. How could a demon be blessed by Sol Invicta? None of this made sense. Was this being's very existence heresy? Should he put an arrow into its chest and rid the world of this evil? What would the Sun Elf lords do to him if they found out he had been in the presence of a demon? Eilvig took a breath and remembered the calming presence of the cat-eyed creature. It wanted me to help this thing. It saved me as a child and led me here today. I cannot forsake its one request.